Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this webinar about Agile Methodologies in the framework of the AT Virtual Project. My name is Roberto Parrondo. I'm the Business Services Coordinator of CEI Asturias, which is the lead partner of this AT Virtual project. This project is funded by the Interreg 5P Atlantic Space Program, which aims to increase safety and security in maritime operations. Operations by means of accelerating the digitalization process of the maritime safety training centers, organizations that have the role to train staff teams in performing emergency operation in very high risk conditions. So this digitalization process will allow the centers to increase, to introduce cutting-edge technologies regarding Internet of Things, big data analytics, and vision technologies in simulation-based training systems by collaborating with the startups of the Atlantic space, who will act as digital enablers. So in order to do that, in order to accomplish this mission, the project has three well-defined stages. The first one is the diagnosis, is about the determination of the digitalization status of the centers, to know what are their needs and also to proceed to the definition of the challenges. The next one is the selection, is basically to launch three independent calls involving Internet of Things and big data analytics and vision technologies. And these calls are addressed to startups of the Atlantic space who will participate, proposing their solutions to the challenges previously defined. And the third one is the implementation, that is carried out once the parents, once the teams of the centers and the startups have been completed. So in order to help them to do that and to speed up the process, they will have access to dedicated methodology based on agile methodologies, such as the webinar that we are going to attend today, and also another tools and another webinars in very key relevant topics, okay? Just to finish my presentation, I would like to introduce you the consortium that is going to make possible the development of this project. We have three specific types of partners: the Maritime Safety Training Centers, of course, because they are the key actors of the project. They are going to participate in every stage. So in our case, we count on the participation of the SASEMAR Centro Jovellanos in Asturias, in Spain. We also count on the Manchester Technological University in Cork, in Ireland, and also we are going to incorporate we are about to incorporate another center from Portugal. The bigs also are very important, specifically in the selection stage, since they are going to act as national contact points, and they have to encourage their local community of startups to participate in the different calls. So in our case, we have Laval Maillet Technopole in Laval, in France, Corbic in Cork, Ireland, and Instituto Pedro Nunes in Portugal, and also, as I said, CEI Asturias acting as a lead partner of the project. And last but not least, the Tecnalia Foundation, which is, as you all know, one of the largest R&D performance in Europe. And they have a key role specifically in the diagnosis stage. And also, they were going to assist the centers and the startups in the definition and the implementation of the solution. So that's all by my side. Thanks again for your attendance, and I hope you enjoy this webinar. And I think, Rui, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Hi, everyone. My name is Rui Miranda. I'm representing Instituto Pedro Nunes, one of the Portuguese partners of AT Virtual. So this webinar specifically is our responsibility, let's say like this. So the session of today is about agile methodologies. So today's session aims to make a first approach to the new ways of working, from project to product, from product to service, and also an overview of organizational structures. Today's speaker is António Ferreira. He founded Fiercely. Fiercely is an IT and software development company based in Coimbra, here in Portugal. His academic background is, so he has a software engineering in the University of Coimbra and an MBA in the Portuguese Catholic University. He has extensive experience in information and technology programming and consulting, as well as in managing software development teams. Just quickly, some house rules. So today's session is roughly 90 minutes. Probably a bit less. You can put questions and comments during the session, and António will answer it as he can. So probably he will answer some of the questions during the session, and the questions that he could not answer, we will do it by at the end of the session when we will have more time to Q&A. I think this is it from my side. António, the floor is yours, and whenever you're ready, we can move on to the session.
All right. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rui. Thank you to the Interreg project for that webinar. I hope you can all see my screen. So I'm going to be a bit ambitious. We're going to try to get through roughly 90 slides in 90 minutes. So some are faster than others. And I'm definitely going to bring some history so we're all on the same shared understanding, and we can talk about what the new ways of working are, even if they did start to be defined a bit a long time ago. Okay, so I take it you can see my screen. I just need some visual confirmation of that. So either Rui or António, it's visible, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Okay, so let's get right to it. So as Rui said, just for full disclosure and not to take too long, I am an MSc in software engineering. I did the poor man's MBA part in project management. So I did part of the executive MBA in project management. And I founded Fiercely, mostly as a practitioner, solving the same problems in the same type of companies and industries. So basically, I saw patterns emerging of always solving the same type of problems with the same type of frameworks and technologies. So this was the same for telco, IoT environments, as it was for insurance, as it was for safety critical systems and embedded systems development, which I was also involved in. I'm a DevOps Institute accredited instructor. I'm also, I have a CCP, which is the Portuguese certification to deliver formal training. I'm an open source contributor, and I'm a certified Kubernetes administrator, amongst other things too. So hopefully, if you have questions on that, I can get to that too. So what will we be talking about today? So a brief overview of why Agile, and trying to frame the problem that Agile is trying to solve. We're also going to talk about the ways of working, the history, the current practices, and the changes that we are trying to enact specifically with Agile methodologies, and the undercurrent to the trend that is bringing about Agile, that is going from project to product thinking, product-centric approach, something that lasts a bit longer in time, all the way to service. So you'll notice this throughout the slides, this evolution. We'll also talk about something that I think is finally emerging, which is organizational structures that we use and how these can make or break your Agile methodologies and how important they are, and to be intentful about the way you organize your company. There's hope. There's some stories that come from the Toyota production systems, which is roughly 50 to 60 years ago. So there's also hope from those adoptions. And we'll be talking about Agile specifically, history, frameworks, practices, and challenges. So we go a bit further. We'll try to get some practices in there too. And we'll talk about the organizational structures for the new ways of working, the ones we see that actually help out with Agile and the ones that achieve better performance. So yeah, let's get to it then. So the question about why Agile, we need to ask the question, weren't we doing just fine? And the data is in, right? So there's a study from 2010 that gets thrown about a lot that defines IT projects as having a success rate of 33%. So across the industry, it's not much better, but IT projects in particular, as of 2010, per the Standish Group report, only had a success rate of 33%. And here we're going to define success loosely as they were on time, they were on budget, and they were on quality-ish. So they were acceptable to the customer on that front. So there's some other figures that we could have thrown up that are also very interesting from studies from about the same time. Things such as the average cost overrun of all projects is 27%. So not only in IT, but across industries, projects tend to overrun in cost by roughly a quarter, and 50% of projects fail due to breakdown in communications, 57%. So half of them fail due to breakdowns in communications. So that's an interesting finding, because project management is considered a mature discipline, and even though it's still evolving, these figures speak for themselves. So the idea is, no, everything is not fine. So let's define where it's not fine. So it's not fine for the teams involved in the project, and they feel this. It's not fine for the customers and contract negotiations that come about it. And it's not fine for the poor old project managers. So everybody's kind of unhappy. You have an unhappy worker, unhappy project manager, unhappy customer. Clearly something is not fitting here. So roughly the problem is we're over time and we're over budget. And this is true especially for projects, especially big ones. As we've seen in the report of 2010, in IT in particular, only 32% met their mark. There's also studies from 2017 by the PMI that report, which is the Project Management Institute, they report the project success rates are finally improving. They're still not great. So let's highlight some passages from this report. The report is called Pulse of the Profession from 2017. It's publicly available. I'll be leaving the links in the slides to come. But the interesting thing about it is that organizations that embrace agile methodologies and practices for project management are more likely to be successful. So the rates are improving, but we're seeing a very high correlation with adoption of agile methodologies. So that's a really interesting finding. Let's go through some facts and figures to set the scene completely. So this is from the Pulse of the Profession, and I'm going to highlight the parts that I find the most interesting. So they've divided the project performance between champions and underperformers. But for me, one of the interesting things, especially in figure 2 of this report, is that the amount of projects that still experience scope creep is quite high. So even for champions, they're somewhere between a quarter to a third having trouble managing scope. And as we will see, agile methodologies are all about managing scope more than managing schedule and budget. So that's really interesting. There's still space for agile to help out. And the underperformance, of course, 2/3 are having problems with managing scope. So definitely need for agility or agile practices there. I'll also highlight the strategic initiatives, which are usually things that are sometimes have lesser project management practices, or are also called pre-project activities in some scenarios. But to me, the interesting finding is that still 60% of them are meeting their goals. So roughly half of them are not meeting their goals of their strategic initiatives. So this is really interesting. Is this a lack of feedback? Is this a lack of course correction during the project execution? So are we not incorporating change enough, which again is a key principle of agile methodologies versus traditional project management? So the figures are really interesting to me. And to finish off the facts and figures that you can go through the report, I'll also highlight the primary causes of those failures. So the projects that were deemed failures, regardless of champions or underperformers, there's two really interesting topics. So the top reason starts with change, and the third top reason starts with change too. So the reason projects failed is because of change. So clearly we need something that is better and more responsive to change. I have the contention, as has much of the community, that Agile is all about incorporating change. So if we incorporate change, hopefully we won't have as much failure as is being reported here. So, like I said, they're available here. There's a backing article about this data in CIO if you prefer to read just the sort of executive summary, but the bottom link is where the PDF is for all the data I just presented. So that's the tone for why Agile. So we know everything is not fine, and we've just seen the data for the traditional projects. So let's talk about smaller, loosely scoped projects, things that usually you can't really do project management, proper project management on them. It's projects that maybe can start and finish before you've done all the work breakdown structure and the baseline creation and established all these dependencies that we see here, so you can do automatic scheduling and think about crashing and resource leveling. It takes so long, and they are so intensive, these project management practices, that some projects are underserved because they need to be executed on a quicker timeline, and they can't really wait for all of the practices to be in place, for all the scoping, de-risking, all of the necessary activities to actually start. So these are underserved. Loosely scoped projects are also underserved in the sense that we all know this, and manufacturing industries know this, because they need to prototype to order. Sometimes they need to prototype a new evolution of a product, and they don't do it in traditional project management activities from our experience. So they do what's called front-end innovation and new product development stage before going to full commercialization and actual rollout of a product. So these are also not being served by traditional project management initiatives. Again, they look at very long-running, big budget, tight schedule projects over a big course of long course of time. So along with this, we have a shift not only in the way companies are trying to operate and be more agile. We have a shift on the demand side. So on the customers, be them in the supply chain or be them the end customers, they have changed. They have developed an app mentality. This also means an interesting thing. Not only are they a bit more impatient, and we can look at it negatively, but they are willing to take some risk together. They are willing to co-create. So co-creation is now very much an option. So your betas, your prototyping, your MVPs, your walking skeletons, especially in non-established industry and segments, are definitely places where innovation can occur and where a more agile project can thrive directly with customers and hopefully being viable from the first day. So in summary, we're talking about a difference between a structured project and an agile project. So this is a domain problem, right? So where does each one of them apply? So for those of you familiar with the Quinifin framework by Dave Snowden, you will understand what's being presented here. For those of you that are not familiar, I'll go through it really briefly. So the Quinifin framework has been around for a while, and there's an article from the Harvard Business Review presented as a leader's framework for decision making. And this was back in 2007. So roughly 6 years after the Agile Manifesto. And the idea is that you are operating in one of four domains: the predictable domain, the complicated domain, the complex domain, or the chaotic domain. Now, the predictable domain is the place for known knowns. It's the place for obvious reasoning. So there are best practices. It's easy to understand what's being done, and there's one good way of doing things, and that's what we should do. So here, structured projects very much make sense. We already know how things fail. We already know the best practices So structured projects do still operate in the predictable space, but we've been constantly moving towards a complicated space and a complex space. In the complicated space, it's the domain of experts. So it's the known unknowns. So this is the type of, there's at least one good response, at least one good practice. So it's not best practice, it's good practices. And in context, a domain expert can make decisions. In the complex space, which is where we see the agile projects being the most beneficial, it's the place for unknown unknowns. Chaos is unknowable, so you need to try and staunch the bleeding. It's not really easy to develop projects like that. You need to try and move from chaos to one of these other domains. So in the complex, it's the idea that you have unknown unknowns. It's the pattern for emergence. It's the pattern for testing, probing, and seeing how systems respond, how clients and customers respond, how products respond to the way we're developing them. So an agile project makes a lot of sense here, because we need to try and put things out, collect the feedback, and see how the behaviors and the practices emerge. And then we can probably start defining the good practices, bringing it down to a complicated scenario, context, and eventually the best practices as it becomes a commodity. So going from developing a product in a complex scenario all the way to it's now a commodity, we can do structured projects on this. So this is the domain of an agile project usually. It's very well suited for complex emergent practice scenarios. So let me just check the chat. If anybody has doubts on that, I'll address them quickly. As Rui said, for the sake of time, please put your questions in the chat. I'll try to address them. I like to do this a bit more dynamic and a bit more interactive. So if I see your chat questions, I'll try and address them as I go. Okay, so this was structured project versus agile project. And also an interesting side note too. If you've seen the movies for the Apollo 13 projects, if you want analogies for each of these scenarios, basically you need to think of the complex is the idea that the idea is there's a Ferrari versus a Brazilian rainforest. So a Ferrari is complicated, you can understand it. The complex, you kind of understand how a rainforest works, but if you try and do things, you're not sure what the reaction is going to be. If you take apart a Ferrari or you try to do some things, you know what the system's going to react like. For the Apollo 13 movie reference, it's really interesting because the first thing they say is, Houston, we have a problem. And suddenly people need to swarm and try and understand. Swarming is also an agile practice. Try and understand what the problem is to then define what they should do, what the practice should be. So it's definitely an emergent thing. There was no previous knowledge. It's not predictable. There's no best practice. There's not necessarily even good practices. So Houston, we have a problem. Let's iterate over it. Let's go agile. So agile is all about accommodating for change. And as you saw in the Pulse of the Profession, out of the 3 top reasons for project failure, there were changes, right, in the top 3. So we are definitely shifting, especially when we adopt agile, from managing change, resisting change to a sense, to incorporating change. So the feedback loop for agile projects is a lot more intensive. We do not wait for UAT, which is user acceptance testing. We do not wait for a full-on contract defined acceptance phase to get the feedback. We try to understand if we're going in the right direction so we can course correct. Remember, you're either operating in the setting of best practice and commodity and known problem spaces, or you're operating in a differentiation, customization, co-creation environment. And those, you need to react to change. So yeah, going from managing change to incorporating change is essential. We're going from big upfront design and specification, because it's definitely very much the unknown unknowns, to just enough specification to get the feedback we need, to understand if we're going in the right direction, if our hypotheses were right. So sometimes we can develop something, expect a result, and get exactly the opposite. We should get that feedback and course correct as fast as possible. And to do this, you need to bring the stakeholders and the customers along on the journey. Again, it's not predictable. They do not necessarily know what they absolutely want. They are co-creating with you. They're trying to understand also if this suits them. Again, structured projects, it's predictable. So customers and stakeholders know what you're going to deliver because it's a commodity. They do not want to co-create with you because it's a domain of give me something I already see, I already know, I already have, something that's already available in the market. For the Agile project, they do not know. They are co-creating. They are willing to take on some risk. You need to bring them along the journey. You also need to create an environment for high-performing teams. If you want to react to change, incorporate change, you need the high performance for that feedback loop to be effective. So we're going from resources and individual, especially on the people side of things, we're going from individual attribution to projects to having teams that iterate. So the unit has become a bit bigger, and we'll posit that a team is bigger than the sum of its individual parts. And remember, these teams potentially exist independently of projects and initiatives. They will probably survive over several projects, so their high performance doesn't get squandered when a new product, a new project shows. You should also delay decisions and maximize the work not done. Now, this goes very much against common culture and some scenarios where you definitely want to try and reduce risk. Now, bear with me, we will get to the justification for this, and there are articles supporting this. So if you want to have support for going against the conventional wisdom, which would be make as many decisions and do as much work for de-risking as possible, look at the Toyota's second paradox and look at the Agile values and principles and how they're bringing results. We will be going into these in future slides. So yes, quick break on that. So that was basically the problem statement. This is why Agile is emerging. This is where Agile is most effective. This is where project management is having problems, right? So we're going from project that tries to resist change so it gets done in a timescale to an emergent project where you co-create, where you're actually thinking about the customer. You're thinking a lot more like a product. So let's get to the history of the ways of working and how we got to this place where these problems exist and where some of the solutions are emerging. I still see nothing in the chat, so either I'm boring you or I'm looking at the wrong place. Hopefully, it's me looking at the wrong place. So ways of working. Let's look at the past 100 years, which is basically what's been informing our practices. Let's look at the past 100 years up to today's management practices. So a bit of history here. So roughly around 1900, obviously a bit before, we were talking about mass production. We were talking about Henry Ford and his factories. We were talking about the first fully integrated production process, right? So from here, you have the famous sentence uttered by Henry Ford, which is, you can have the car in any color you like as long as it's black. So this production process was very efficient, very good, but it suffered from a lack of variety. So it couldn't really change. Now, this is perfectly fine for economy of scale, and that's what made it hugely successful. There was really no management and economy of scale practices up till the Henry Ford's factory. So of course, people see success, they're going to emulate success. But this was 100 years ago. So we need to probably think a bit past that. At the same time, around you had Taylorism and Gantt. So Taylor and Gantt actually had offices close to each other, and they were developing most of the current management practices. So you were looking at functional driven organizations. So Taylor was doing organizational structure and career paths and defining around functional driven organizations. So functional driven organization would be things like, here's our development teams, here's our testing teams, or here's our customer engagement team. So very much, well, actually our marketing team, that's more on the function side. So we were developing structures where functions and specialization were suiting the mass production paradigm. So specialists, very much focused, being as productive as possible. So basically, irking every possible ounce out of our meat units productivity. Gantt was developing his Gantt charts and his work breakdown structures. We were still in the mass production economy of scale paradigm. It still makes sense in some environments, by the way. Looking onto the 1950s to the 1970s, we start to see the emergence of project management, big projects. And we also see at the same time the Toyota production system, so manufacturing, which was very much product-centric, and the lean movement emerging. So we see project management and product management kind of emerging at the same time. So you see the Navy, this is the American Navy, by the way, using PERT, which is the, as we know, the program or project evaluation and review technique. We see critical path methods showing up. So we're looking at very focused and sound engineering practices for controlling cost and time, specifically for CPM, and for repetitive tasks in nature, and also for non-repetitive tasks in the PERT. We're looking at planning and schedule. So the Department of Defense, NASA projects, the launch of space shuttles, so much was being done here, especially on the software side too. They were undertaking practices for large budget, schedule-driven projects. Nothing about scope necessarily, right? The scope was what was needed to be done. We weren't managing scope. We were managing schedule and cost, okay? The Toyota production system, which was basically, it started before the war, but it really took a strength between 1945 to 1975 with Taiichi Ohno and AG Toyota. Some of you will have heard the American work on this from Deming, who's a great thinker and someone I cannot recommend enough to read. So they were focusing a bit more on flow and variability and incorporating change. So the lean movement was very much looking at trying to control the flow of the work. So we were starting to see some reaction to change, some detection of change, and some trying to account for variability. So not anything particular in scope yet, but something about incorporating change into process and how to react to it. So some things about empowerment, about the customer voice started showing up during the lean movement. So around 1986 and 1995, we start moving away from project management, definitely, especially with the advent of an article in the Harvard Business Review by Hirotaka Takeuchi and Ikujiro Nonaka, relating to rugby and stressing team collaboration for product success. So the name of the article, you can read it in Harvard Business Review, was the new product development game. So they were already considering that it was new is actually the title. So we're talking about product development. We're leaving the idea of project management. We're very much moving towards product here. And the interesting thing that most people don't realize, this is what then became Scrum. And because they did reference rugby, the sport, in this article in '86. So interesting things there. It wasn't IT driven. So if you look at this publication, it does not mention IT in any way or form. So the origin of Scrum, even though we equate it to IT projects, actually comes outside of IT. Scrum was started more or less at the same time, but it was formalized in 1995 at UPSLA in Austin, Texas, by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. They were also initial signatories of the Agile Manifesto, but they were developing Scrum before the Agile Manifesto existed. So really interesting things. They were also developing scaled Agile practices, which we'll be talking about in the future. And by 2001, as hopefully all of you know, we have the Agile Manifesto, which is the guiding principles and values behind most of the frameworks, such as Scrum, SAFe, which are the Scaled Agile framework for enterprise. So the Agile Manifesto became something as a counterculture to the existing practices. So it took us about 100 years to actually challenge the existing paradigm and practices, or at the very least to try and gather around something that worked better for what we were seeing. Now, this Agile Manifesto was very much IT driven. So that's why I think Agile gets conflated with IT projects, because the manifesto itself, the 17 signatories, most of them, if not all, were in some way or form software developers. Okay, so that was a brief history. So the ways of working in the current management paradigms were all about resisting change, reducing variability. We can see this in the change approval boards of ITIL or COBIT or any IT service management framework. So those of you with a telco background like me, you'll know about this. You'll know about your support lines. You'll know about your service level agreements, and you'll know about Six Sigma and trying to reduce variability and insert predictability. So there's this undercurrent of the less we change, the more stable we are. And I'm really happy to say that this is finally being challenged. It's taken a while, but there's a public, at least the State of DevOps reports, which are compounded into this book, which is called Accelerate by Nicole Fersgen and Jez Humble and Jean Kim. They plainly state that they do not see trade-offs between speed and stability. So the idea that you need to sacrifice, and here speed, we mean higher throughput of new developments, more change, more frequent releases, more changes to products do not impact stability negatively. They in fact see a positive correlation. So the more you release and the more you produce change in production systems, the more stable you are in the long run. So the facts and figures are there. I'm really happy for this. So it's a false dichotomy. So having heavyweight change approval boards still makes sense for some industries, but if you optimize for speed, the studies show that you will enhance stability because you will be doing more frequent releases, less risky releases. It's really good to know this. So already the current management thinking and paradigms are being challenged on their basic assumptions, and I'm really happy for that. Again, the current management paradigms are mostly economy of scale driven. There's nothing wrong with economy of scale. It's a great way to make money. It's just not the only way to conduct business. And usually before you get to economy of scale, you need to think about scope. You need to think about differentiation. You need to think about developing new products. You need to think about innovation. So if you try and do an economy of scale driven practice, you're going to fail at those stages where you're starting. And you're going to err on the side of specialization, and you're going to err usually on batching for 100% resource utilization over having one-piece flow and streams that cross your organization very much as in single pieces. And we will be looking at a video of what does that mean. Again, like I said, this can work in certain manufacturing and service scenarios like telcos, but they work for the products that are already commoditized. They are pretty static. Those of you in manufacturing or that have to develop products and systems, you know that assembly line reconfiguration is a pain. You know that this is horrible to go through. So you have prototyping teams, most of you, that are doing assembly line work when they're not doing new projects or product development. And then when you get new products, you assign them and you leave the assembly lines for the commoditized products as they are. Most current management paradigms do not think about ramping up and ramping out these structures, and they do not think about ramping up and ramping down organizational structure too. That's also a very interesting finding. So let's talk about the flaws, right? We are operating, and this is still on the reason why Agile is very interesting. We're operating on the idea of near perfect knowledge, and that reduced variability not only is achievable, but is desirable. So for those of you with that are project management professionals or some sort of PMI certification here, I'll ask this question. How many baselines do you end up doing per project, right? So that's an account of variability. And when you're looking at the cost indexes and the schedule index, so the performance, the earned value, how many of you have green all the way up to 90%? The earned value is looking great for 9 months, 13 months, 14 months, and then all of a sudden, 3 months from project finish, earned value goes from 90% to 90.1, 90.2, 90.3, and suddenly everything goes red. But it was fine for 9 to 12 months. So again, even the indicators, even the metrics we have are lying to us because they're not optimizing for change and for reacting to the change. We're optimizing for following a schedule and controlling the cost, and then they fail miserably towards the end. So we definitely need to think if we are operating on economy of scale, and that's fine, or an economy of differentiation. So are we operating in terms of commodities and controlling costs and having the most efficient process possible, or are we creating scope? Are we looking at differentiation? Are we looking at resource leveling or scope leveling, right? So are we trying to assign the resources in the most efficient and earliest deadline possible using PERDs and CPMs and crashing in all of these techniques? Or are we trying to understand what scope is the most valuable for the next iteration? This is an agile principle. So in terms of learning from your systems and your management practices, you can be in one of two scenarios. You can be on a knowledge-based scenario or a performance-based scenario. These are the feedbacks you can get. So traditional approaches like waterfall are very much on the knowledge focus. So trying to have the known and everything should be known knowns, and we try to de-risk and we try to make everything known knowns. Modern approaches such as Agile and Scrum, which is the framework of Agile, are very much performance focused. So your indicators are all about how fast are we going, how are we reacting to change, how much value are we delivering per increment. So they're very much based on the performance more than the knowledge itself. If you needed any more reason for changing the current ways of working, let's go to Dr. Winston Royce, who published Managing the Development of Large Software Systems in 1970. So this sentence in this book says, I believe in this concept, but the implementation described above is tricky and invites failure. So for those of you trying to guess what he's talking about, if you guessed the waterfall approach, you were absolutely right. So the person that proposes the waterfall approach immediately in 1970 says, this is tricky and invites failure. And guess what? We all went along and decided this is a way to develop systems. So the planning, design, coding, it's actually not these terms, it's the ADDIE, so analysis, design, but it's more or less the same idea that you do things sequentially and you only move from planning to design and design to coding when the whole phase before it is finished. There is no way to course correct in that scenario. If you're coding something and you realize there's a design flaw, you have a problem because design should have been closed. So this is why we need to change. Things are dynamic, especially in the unpredictable, the complex space. Things will change, and change will lead to failure if we follow traditional management approaches. We've seen this in facts and figures. So again, based on things such as the first law of systems thinking by Peter Senge, there are 11 laws to system thinking. The first one is today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So again, if you want to let me just recover the chat here because I think I saw something coming through. No, okay. So today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So there's still context for project management. I've said this and I believe this, and I still see good results in project management. The facts are there. Don't take my word for it. But the assumptions they make are too many to be broadly applicable. So if you're an economy of scale, if it's known and knowns, if it's a commodity, by all means, do traditional project management. It's great. It's probably the best suited tool. But there are too many assumptions for it to be broadly applicable. When designing products, economies of differentiation or scope applies, so very much different. They are innovation focused, they are non-commodity. Think about your digital transformations. I'm not talking about digitalization. So taking an existing process and revenue model or business and just taking it digital isn't digital transformation. Digital transformation is looking at something and thinking, how can I do this differently with digital technologies? So you're creating new products. So all your digital transformation projects usually have better results by going with Agile because you don't know, you've been doing it in non-digital fashion. And digitization is not digital transformation. Let's be clear about that. There are also other challenges to the existing ways of working. We look at org structures, we look at org charts, we look at the project management plans, we look at the BERT and the CPM. There is nothing about communication patterns, be them formal or informal. There is nothing about collaboration and co-creation. And if there is, it's very much a practitioner-driven approach of what works and what doesn't work. So it's not widespread. And we've been through these problems by defining matrix organization and shared services. We've seen where the current management paradigms fail, and we've developed counter movements to it, right? So we already know this. So we need to think intentfully, are we en route to mass production or mass customization or any other paradigm that we want to use to make a decision of should we go on Agile? So let's define what the actual change of having Agile methodologies really is. So in the waterfall approach that you're probably all familiar with, you go from planning to design to coding to testing to release to review. You do planning, you bring your planners, your best planners, they're 100% specialized and focused on just doing planning, and then they move on. Now you bring your designers. Sometimes it can be the same people, sometimes it doesn't. You bring them on and you say, okay, you start this work and you do it as soon as the other is finished, or there's at least enough for you to start developing from there. And this is the traditional approach. So you do functions and different stages, and you can't deliver anything until the end. And you can only review once you don't deliver plans, you don't deliver designs, you don't deliver code, or at least if you do, clients can't really do anything with it. Clients, customers, whichever way you want to define it. The person receiving it is receiving an artifact that's not necessarily actionable. It's not something that's going to elicit feedback. So the actual change of Agile is precisely on that sense of delivering things. So we're doing the same approaches, but in iterations. We're doing design, coding, testing, release. We're doing vertical slice. So we're planning, we're doing the work, and at the end, we review the work we've done. Ideally, we review it with the customers and the stakeholders, and we'll deliver something that will give us actionable feedback. It will allow us to course correct, be it our practices because we're bad at designing, because we have low quality, because our testing procedures are failing, or it can be as simple as, I actually enjoy the product, but I do not value what you have done because this is missing. And we go on to the next iteration. So as we saw, 60% of the strategic initiatives fail to meet their goals. Would you rather fail to meet your goal at the end of a project, or would you rather fail to meet your goal in iteration 1, 2, or 3 and have time to course correct? This is the difference with Agile. So another view on this is the idea that you go from the one-off activities to vertical slices. So this is where we're turning Agile and looking at verticality. So we develop a full increment that has been through analysis, test, design, and been coded. We're going through continuous activities and delivering at the end of each cycle in an Agile methodology. So functionally, it's very much the same. It's just the way we organize and the slicing we do that is very different. We also do this, as we saw, in iterations, but we also do it incrementally. You will find in the literature different definitions for incremental and iterative delivery. Actually, you'll find them, you'll find different opposing definitions from well-known authors that have great articles in the space. The idea that we need to come away with is iterations, iterating over something is the idea that you're delivering stuff for course corrections. So you're doing small iterations to get the feedback. The incremental is you're fledging it out as you go through these iterations. So at first you could have delivered just a partial feature set of a billing system, of a tracking and GPS system that just beams out information of I'm here. So a squawk code for a flight system, a manned flight system. But then you can start developing, okay, now that it's squawking and it's alerting everybody of its presence, let's also make it listen. So that's incremental. So I did an increment, I delivered it, I got feedback, and then I do another increment on the same functionality. And I do this over iterations. So here's from the SRA, a very interesting slide that shows on the top iterations where you can course correct, there's a rough sketch, and increments where you actually deliver something fully functional, but not the whole product. So I don't bore you too much. Let's go for a video about another interesting topic of Agile methodologies, which is the idea of one-piece flow versus the batch production that I was talking about. So these iterations lend themselves very well to smaller, fully featured vertical slices, but it also lends itself to better flow across systems. So let me just check if the video is going to play. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is on the top, we have the traditional, we have an order of 10, we're going to have a batch of 10. On the bottom, we're going to have a batch of 1, so one-piece flow. And in the middle, we've got an intermediate process. So on the top one, what you're seeing is very similar to waterfall. You're optimizing for as soon as I get the whole process 1, which is the first column, done, I can move a whole batch. And it's been really resource efficient because I only start working when there's enough work to justify going to the next process. But as you can see, in 30 seconds, we delivered an order of 10 in the one-piece flow, and we limited work in progress, which is also very important for our cognitive load and reducing burnout. As you can see, it was a lot faster. So the idea of doing smaller increments also has a benefit in terms of delivery and in terms of load on systems and people. So it's it's easier to balance out. Also, if you think about it, let's look at what's happening here. Let's think about a defect. So if we find a defect in the first batch, so one piece, it could probably mean our process is wrong and we can course correct for that. If you look at the batch process in the top, there's no feedback yet. We have no idea if the batch that's coming has any sort of defect. There is no place for course correction, right? We wait for a whole batch, and potentially the whole batch could be bad. In the one-piece flow, you're going to get a chance to course correct because you will have signaling systems. You will have a flow of one piece that could be defective, and you can look and see, is this an indicator that just this piece had a defect, or is my whole process going to produce defects? So one-piece flow is very important also for course correction and for feedback. Think about percent of accurate and complete work and the return to development from QA and from ops in traditional IT scenarios. How much faster is it if you don't have to wait as long as you do in the batch process, and you can start giving feedbacks on one-piece flows? It's really important. It's the same for the customers, right? It doesn't have to be internal to the company. One-piece flow enables faster feedback, enables customer agility too. There is space for course correction. It's better for change. So let's do a little break there. Let me just check the chat real quick. Okay, so either I'm saying very obvious things or I'm doing a really good argument of defining these paradigms and the shift towards Agile. So as we saw in the history, we're going from project to product and product to service in terms of practices. So let's define this a bit further. I like to start with the traditional project management practices. So here are some definitions and practices. I'm only going to highlight 2 practices that I remember using a lot and seeing them used a lot in projects is to try to get them back in control. These were fast tracking and crashing. So for those of you that follow the space, you know that fast tracking and crashing the critical path are 2 ways of, so either you're trying to put the schedule back in place by parallelizing things, which is very much what Agile does in the vertical slicing, or you're trying to give more resources to the critical path so you actually get it back into schedule. So you're trying to achieve better flow. It's really interesting that the 2 main practices of project management are all about, fast tracking is all about parallelizing the work and sort of vertical slicing, which we saw is the mindset of Agile, and crashing is all about achieving better flow, not necessarily effectively because you're just throwing more resources at the problem. Outsourcing, bringing more people, creating more rooms, whichever way you look at it, it's trying to achieve better flow. It's just not a very efficient way of doing it. So, as we know, a project has a well-defined start and finish date. So these practices are still going to be there. Nobody's going to optimize for flow in a system that's going to be disbanded at some point. So this is where the main opposition towards the manufacturing paradigms and the idea of a product, this is where project falls short. You are not going to optimize flow unless you're a very forward-thinking organization for something that has a specific start and finish date. There are some counter arguments to agility in project management, and you will see 2 practices defined in the PMI, especially in the PMBOK, the most recent one, about rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration. So already project management understands that they're trying to define too much up front, and that the level of predictability is not going to happen, the one they expect. So there are 2 practices about only fledging out the project as we go through certain stages. The problem here again is we're not looking at full vertical slicing. We're still talking about progressive elaboration. So yeah, basically, the idea here is that project management can be agile. They're trying to be agile, but they're still failing in the same points, even with these practices. It's the communication breakdown, like we saw in, and I mentioned in the first slide. So 58% of projects fail because of communication breakdown. And you saw that the 3 reasons for project failure, out of the 3 top reasons for project failure, change with the key factors. So current project management doesn't solve this. It doesn't optimize for change. It still tries to resist it. So it's not project management's fault. It's just that it's in the wrong domain from some of the work. So there's a great thinker also from the Lean movement, which is called Eliyahu Goldratt. Those of you that have read about DevOps or the Phoenix project from Gene Kim, this is the author that inspired the whole books and movement behind it. And he said something very poignant, which is no matter how detailed the plan, it cannot make the uncertain certain. And Agile is great at this. They know that we can't make the uncertain certain, but we can react to it. We can create signaling mechanisms. So we are definitely seeing benefits from moving from project to product. So from the idea of something that is going to be disbanded and we don't really optimize the flow, we're looking at something that's usually longer lived than projects. Potentially, it doesn't mean the projects don't get retired. It doesn't mean the assembly lines don't get thrown out. It's just that there's this idea of optimizing for flow. Something's going to be longer lived, and the teams working on this are also going to survive longer than the project. So products are very scope driven. That's one of the major changes of going from project to product. They are being defined and delivered on a feature basis. There's some variance to that, but that's the gist of it. So each feature has a potential value and or a revenue model associated with it. Otherwise, it doesn't get developed. So it's really interesting. There's not that slow march to death of a project that everybody knows was strategic, but everybody knows is going to fail. The product is a lot more reactive. So either there's a revenue model waiting at the end of it, or we shouldn't be developing this. So it's a lot better there. And the features, the feedback is instant. Either they get adopted or not. Either they get loved or they get hated. They're going to get to the customer's hand. And sometimes the customer is also the end user. So it's really interesting there. Going to product changes the mindset. That's why it's really interesting. Again, customer feedback is essential for selecting the features and prioritization. Some companies do this by talking to their customers directly. Others do benchmarks, think tanks. Doesn't really matter. The idea is we're looking for feedback. It's very much different from we're looking for cost optimization, schedule optimization of a project. We're looking not necessarily to co-create. We're looking outside of our system for how is this going to be an impact and how is this going to be adopted. So you develop a feature, you measure adoption before progressing to future steps. So there's a lot about course correction in product management. So products usually, again, this is my thinking, there's a lot more you can read about this, but the gist of it is there's a profit point between the revenue model, the development, and the production cost. I'm not talking about operational cost, I'm talking about production cost. So if we're doing a feature that's going to cost more than someone's going to pay for it, it's immediately something that we shouldn't even be thinking, or we should optimize immediately. And this is where going from product to service is also very interesting. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. It's still very much a moving space. We've all heard about software as a service. So let's just say that services are the natural evolution from products. So they're especially valuable when ownership isn't necessarily valued, or it's a physical asset. So think it's not a physical asset that you have. Think your streaming services, your Disney Pluses, your Netflixes. So you don't really need to own the things, you just want access to the service. And traditional products can be transformed and sold as a service, right? Your car can be leased and you can not buy it at the end. The most famous paradigm shift of this, and you have the advanced manufacturing plant in Sheffield, where Rolls-Royce is also doing some really interesting things in terms of manufacturing plants and agility in manufacturing plant reconfiguration. Rolls-Royce notably defined a model for selling engine flight hours instead of the engines. So this also puts a different thinking in place too, which is really interesting, which is if we become better at building engines, and if we become better at reducing the operational costs and doing better flow, all of the upside can be on our can contribute to both our top line and bottom line, right? So we're selling engine flight hours more than engines, and we're also selling the maintenance plans, the evolution of this engine. So we start to own the things that are producing the service. So at the same time, we can also enact change on them a lot more than something that we've handed over to a customer. We can also try and say, look, there's this new piece that if I put, it's going to last another few years. And yeah, I can bring down the price per flight hour if we do this. And it's a different conversation. It's really interesting. It doesn't have to be just this scenario. This is just the one I use to illustrate the point. So the idea of a recurring fee for a service lends itself very well to continual improvement and iterations of a product. So we're also thinking beyond the life cycle. We're involved in a really interesting project here at Fiercely, and because we're in Instituto Pedro Nunes, we're involved in a project where we're looking at the circular economy, right? So service is very much about refurbishing, remanufacturing. This is the type of environments where service makes a lot of sense. You're also evolving the product. The right to repair something means you could actually update it. So going from product to service is really interesting at several revenue levels. So services have a profit point between revenue, development, and operating cost, not production cost, operating cost. And operating has a lot of layers to it. I won't be going into detail there. So yeah, organizational structures. Now this, I thought of how to segue this, and I've been alluding to this during the presentation. One of the key things I see failing for the agile adoptions, the digital transformations, the DevOps adoptions that we do at Fiercely, and things we see failing initially, not necessarily towards the end, but it's one of those clashing moments, is we get the practices in place. We get the skills, we get the people, we get some of the mindset shift and the cultural side right, but still we're fighting the organizational structure. We're trying to get people to collaborate and to think in terms of flow, optimizing for flow across different silos and structures of the company, but then the organizational structure is fighting against us. So let's do a bit of what we did before, defining the current practices, and here we'll be defining the current organizational structures to understand what we're up against and what can make or break your Agile projects. So simply, and there's a great resource, really simple, it has pros and cons, and I recommend you read it in HubSpot, that's delivered as a free PDF. And by free, I mean you give them your data, however you value that, and they give you the PDF. But it's a really interesting resource nonetheless. So basically, you can have two types of organization, either mechanistic or organic, right? And on the organic side, you've got practices such as holacracy, really interesting things there too. I can't go into details today. But nonetheless, the idea is that even in these interesting organic structures, there is no explicit reference to collaboration and communication patterns. So organizational structures usually are very much a command and control construct. Nonetheless, we need to think about them intentfully, because these are what define the career paths. These are what define your boundaries and what's requested of you, and what actually are the incentives you have to collaborate or not outside of your structure. So simply put, you have the hierarchical, which are usually the mechanistic we just saw. You have your mixed structures, and there's some interesting things there to talk about specifically in the Spotify model, or matrix organizations and shared services, which also exist outside of Agile, and the organic structures. So let's go quickly through them. So hierarchical, you can have function-based. This is what we saw that emerged at the beginning of the century with Taylor. So very much about specialization, about getting 100% resource utilization and batching of your most skilled workers, because they're the most expensive. So you try to load them, you batch, you forget about flow, you just think about here's the specialist, right? You can have a product-based organization. This is really interesting because products, again, from project to service, this is a really interesting mindset shift, because it ties into the needle, the financial needles that move, and the ownership of a product, and being able to take some gambles if you think of it as a product. So we'll be going into the details about that one too. Market-based, this is also interesting. And in telco, we see this. There are some problems, I will refer to it, but still an interesting organizational structure too. So none of them are perfect, right? You need to understand where you are to understand the type of results you can get, and how you need to work either with or against the organizational structure you're in. Geographical, when things get really big, you have your EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Asia. You have your Pacific, you have your APAC, Asia Pacific. You have your, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. You've got your America, North America, South America. So when things get really big, you do need some degree of geographical complexity dealt with. And you can do it process-based, which is also a very interesting one too. In the mixed scenarios, we have matrix, which can be something like, here's the market structure and here are the functional specialists, and you assign them to different, so they have two reporting structures. It can be good and can be bad. We'll talk about that in further detail in Agile practices, specifically in the Spotify model. You have the circular scenario, and circular is very similar to functional, but the idea that the way we present it actually is about showing how teams can collaborate at the same layers in an organization. And you have your organic structure. So flat is considered ideal, especially at the team level. And you have your network structures, and we'll be looking at a video from John Cotter about network structures for that. So here's a typical functional organizational structure. You have the CEO, you have your marketing, your sales, your services, whatever. So these are your specialists in marketing, your specialists in sales, and sometimes these don't collaborate enough, and guess what? You get perverse incentives and things don't align properly. But nonetheless, in terms of specialization, by reporting under the same structure, you get a common set of practices and they become very efficient at their specific functions. So that's the advantage of a functional-based hierarchy. You have another divisional one, which is product-based. So here, as you can see, we have electronics division. This is just an example, home goods division, yummy snacks division, but then you have the functions underneath that. So you're going to have marketing for the electronics division, marketing for the home goods division, and marketing for the yummy snacks division. So these potentially you will not pool resources and you'll have inefficiencies because you'll have marketing that reports to electronics divisions, but you do not let them work for home goods division or yummy snacks division, or your process is so different that they can't really help the other teams. So there's no pooling of resources. There's a lot of inefficiency here. So this is what I've highlighted here. So the functional approach usually doesn't have an efficiency in terms of the standard set of practices and the way you pool resources. And that's the basis for the matrix, by the way. So here there's potential inefficiency, but it's very interesting in terms of product thinking, right? So electronics division, you know what you're doing. Your domain knowledge is very much good. So your marketing knows about marketing for electronics division. They have to, because they're serving you as a single customer. So there's really interesting things going on for this type of structure. And yeah, the market-based structure, like I said, this is a problem. This is what happens in telcos, for instance. You have the commercial division, the residential division, your government division. You still have your functions under there and the inefficiencies there. But for those of you, I'm sorry, I missed the, okay, there we go. So for those of you that know about triple play in telco product offering, this was a problem for the telcos when they tried to converge the customers. And some of you might have felt this. You might have like 4 or 5 different account numbers, even though you only have one contract with the telco. This is because of this type of structure, right? So the commercial division would have an ID for you as a customer, but the residential division would have a different ID. So when you're trying to merge all these together as a single portfolio or as a bundling of different markets that you're serving, it becomes a problem because you didn't really collaborate between the commercial division and residential division of what a customer meant. You didn't create a single pane of glass, a single view of your customer across the different markets. So you're a customer for a market and a customer for another, and the experience is really weird on the customer side. So beware of market-based structures that don't talk to each other. Triple play in telco, if you have friends in telco, talk about how they converge their TV services with their mobile services, with their fixed internet access and broadband internet access. This was a serious problem. It still is for some companies. So there's not a lot of agility there. Yeah, process-based. So research and development, customer acquisition, order fulfillment. This is really interesting because here you don't necessarily have functions per se. So it's not engineering practices. It's not marketing practices. It's about the process that your company defined. So if you have a single customer journey, this works really well for some companies. This is how startups usually begin to scale. They have one segment of customers, and it's really interesting and they make their divisions based on how they work. So here's your billing, here's your customer acquisition. It's a very interesting organizational structure too. Oh, sorry, this is just jumping all over the place. Going into the mixed organizational structure. So here we have the matrix structure. So as we see, we have the functions on top. So marketing, sales, and services have all their resources reporting and standardizing and evolving their practices under their function. But at the same time, they're serving a market structure or a product structure, right? This is matrix organization. This is the way we solve the inefficiencies. Tried to solve the inefficiencies of organizational structures to actually serve both an idea of a product and the customer, and at the same time have a bit of an economy of scale in terms of specialization and functionality. So yeah, I'll go into further detail for the sake of time. Let me just go fast. The circular one is really interesting because you have your execs and your managers and your specialists in the marketing, sales, and services. So very similar to the functional. This is just a different way of viewing. Why is this different way of viewing interesting? Because you have the idea that specialists of services have a boundary that they talk to sales and they talk to marketing. And the same goes for managers. Managers are expected to report to the execs, but to talk amongst each other across services, marketing, and sales. So it's not as we saw here in the traditional functional, where maybe marketing, sales, and services don't talk, and the practitioners here don't talk to each other. The circular the circular structure tells you that you should collaborate at your level in the organization, whatever that means. It's an interesting one to look at too. I will not be showing flat or network organizations. As I said, there's a video about network organizations by John Cotter, which is one of the main thinkers. He has the dual operating system, which we'll be seeing. So problems with organizational structures. So there's no mention of the interaction patterns. There's an attempt at that with the circular organizational structure. There are no communication channels in normal org charts. Some teams try to overcome this, and they are very prone to Conway's law. So simply put, Conway's law is the observation by Melvin Conway that solutions, products, software suites tend to be developed and mimic the communication patterns of the teams that develop them. This means, if you look at this, you're going to have a marketing backend and a sales backend and the services backend, even if that makes no sense for the customers in the electronics division. But this is the idea of Conway's law, is the way you design your organization, whether you like it or not, and the way the communication and collaboration structure works will inform your design and the way your systems and products are designed. So be very aware of this. Some people propose the reverse Conway maneuver, which is, by knowing this, design your organization according to the system you want to have in place. This is where I think, and I didn't allude to this perfectly, but this is where I think process-based could be really interesting. So yeah, let's move on for the sake of time. I'm almost getting to the agile practice. So organizational structures, problems with them. It's really easy to design organizational structures and to adopt agile practices. This is something you can see at the PMI. This is part of the disciplined agile. And this is work by Scott W. Ambler, which I've followed since he was at IBM. He's now teamed up with the Project Management Institute, and he shows the several layers of complexity across organizations. So the geographic distribution is a problem. If you're co-located, it's easy. If you're global, it's not easy. The skill availability. So if you're working on low-skilled things, it's easy. You have resources available. If you're working on something very specialized, it's difficult to acquire, it's difficult to train. So you need to design organizations to retain these people, to maintain these teams, to train on the job. So there's lots of layers of complexity. So the main point here is it's really easy to adopt agile practices in this space where the domain complexity is straightforward, the skills availability is pretty much, there's no shortage. The compliance standards and requirements are informal, so there's no governing bodies, no governance, risk, and compliance. The solution complexity is really easy. You can deploy it alone. You don't have dependencies. You don't have third-party vendors. You use open source, and there's no security vulnerabilities. And your whole team is co-located, and it's really small. It's 10 people. This is the basis for agile practices, and they work really well like this. Some of the scaled agile frameworks try to give you ways of working that address all of these complexity vectors. There's a really interesting point to be made here. I don't think, and I think most practitioners are with me on this, that team size, you can't really call something with more than 10 people a team, in my opinion. It's either multiple teams, because there's no communication structure, sane, performing communication structure with more than 8 people, actually, not even 10. So you're not going to interact daily with 250 people. There's just not enough time. So there's something to be said about keeping the team size small. So I wouldn't really call 250 people a team. They need to be broken down in different ways. In smaller teams, teams doing scrum of scrums, there's many options there, but be aware of this. So just to move forward on organizational structures, there is hope. So I recommend reading the second Toyota paradox. This is a slide from the DevOps Institute, for which I'm an accredited trainer. This is for one of the trainings about target operational models and organizational designs within DevOps. So the interesting thing here is, as tempting, and I'm going to read through it. So as tempting as it seems, one cannot reorganize your way to continuous improvement and adaptiveness. Okay, be very aware of that. Now, you should be aware of how this fights or enhances your agile practices. What's decisive is not the form of the organization, it's important, by the way, but how people act and react. So the root of Toyota's success lies not in its organizational structures, but in developing capabilities and habits in its people. It surprises many people, in fact, to find that Toyota is largely organized in a traditional functional department style. So they got a lot of things right, even though they're in a traditional function development style. But they are aware of the organizational structure and how they impact. So this is an article by Mike Rother. This is a quote by Mike Rother on the Toyota Kata. I will be giving you the link to the second Toyota Paradox article too. It's very interesting. And remember, the Toyota production system is from 1958, roughly, up to 1975. So organizational structures, the actual change we see in terms of organizational structures for Agile is taking on a team-centric approach. So not individual people assigned to tasks, not specialists being assigned to tasks, teams. Teams of specialists, teams of functionally oriented individuals, QA, testing, cross-functional at that. So small size, 8 people. There's actually a study conducted by Hackman and Vidmar that suggests that 4.6 people is the perfect team size. So that to me tells me that either they didn't account for holidays and it's 5 people, or there's a person that comes and goes, a specialist every once in a while. So 4 people is the perfect team size, theoretically. So what we see is teams of up to 8 people because of the cross-functional needed. So you need someone that can do development, someone that can do quality assurance, someone that can do testing, someone that can do business analysis. So you need all of these. AWS famously talked about the 2-pizza team, which is the idea. If you bring 2 pizzas to your team and you can't feed everybody, it's not a team, it's too big. Some people will argue that when they're 20 years old, maybe they can eat a whole pizza alone. So take it with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting heuristic. Teams definitely need to be autonomous. So they need to be able to have a full route to production, a full route to life. They need to be able to test out their products without having to impact in other teams' work, because otherwise flow is impeded. They need to be cross-functional. Again, like I said, if you get all of this right, it's easy. This is a team level. No complexity, no dependencies between teams, no small, huge 250 people to develop a whole product. So they're cross-functional, they're long-lived teams. Long-lived teams isn't necessarily written down in Agile, but most of the Agile adoption does this because they acknowledge Tuckman's model, which is teams go through the storming, norming, forming, and performing phases. So when they're storming, they're getting to know each other, and it takes a while. It takes months in some cases. Then they start norming, they start to understand how they work, and they do the forming, they do the norming, and then they get to performing. How bad would it be is as soon as the team is performing, it's becoming a bit more predictable, they know how they work, they can rely on each other, you disband that team. That's very inefficient in terms of resource usage. Individually, you do that in projects. In an Agile approach, you try to keep teams, because there's also another thing there. The domain complexity and learnings of the team are kept, especially for long-lived products. So teams also take work from backlogs, not from organizational structure in Agile. So the backlog is owned by a product owner, and he puts what he wants there. The team has no say in that, but the team does not take work from several sources. It takes from a single source that's normalized, that makes it easy for everybody to work. So yeah, in theory, you should be able to spin up and tear down teams as needed. So Agile, definitely, shift in culture, shift in practices. So let's talk about the Agile practices, the methodologies, and let's go into details now. So the Agile Manifesto, as we saw in the history, was written in 2001 at Snowbird, Utah. It was co-signed by 17 practitioners, of which 2, for instance, were Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber, and Alistair Coburn and Martin Fowler of ThoughtWorks. But Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber were the ones that had written Scrum. And so Scrum existed before the Agile Manifesto. They all agreed upon 4 key values and 12 principles. And why is this important? We'll see this in an Agile Onion in a second. So this is the setting, the leading sentence in the Agile Manifesto. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others. So very much about an empirical feedback loop. So uncovering, we still don't know what are the better ways, but we're doing it and helping others to do it. And through this, we have come to value, and here come the 4 manifesto values. So we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, because contract negotiation, you're probably already unsatisfied, and responding to change over following a plan. This is the key breakaway from project management at the time. Now, there's an interesting part about this. They say, while there's value in the things on the right, so there's value in processes and tools, there's value in comprehensive documentation, and there's value in contract negotiation, and there's value in following the plan, the Agile Manifesto values individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change more than the others. So there are also 12 principles, and I need to go through them so they get ingrained, but I've highlighted the keywords here. So the first principle is really about the highest priority is satisfying the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Now, if you take out software, this applies to any industry. Early and continuous delivery of our product, early and continuous delivery of our project, whichever way you want to go about it. The second principle is very important too. You welcome change. You don't resist it. You don't fight it. So it's these 2 alone are very interesting there. So, yeah. So this is definitely the point that the Agile Manifesto drives through. We need to develop a system that reacts to change. We need to deliver frequently. We need to try and satisfy the customer. We need to bring on the business, so business people and developers must work together daily. The idea is you also trust and have autonomy. That's principle 5. So you build around motivated individuals, you give them the environment and support they need, and you trust them to get the job done. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. So a lot more on the people and interaction than processes and tools. And working software is the primary measure of progress. So Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. So here's the idea. Whichever system we arrive at, it needs to maintain a constant pace. So this is about predictability and avoiding burnout. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. So very important here. We're not talking about doing things haphazardly. Simplicity, and I really like the 10th principle, is the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. So this is completely against the dreaded grudge of death of project management. From one certain point in most projects, you know the project is going to fail. And it's not just that it's going to be over budget and over schedule. It's going to fail because market has changed and you're developing something that the market has already found a better solution or no longer makes sense. So here the Agile Manifesto says that maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. This means getting the feedback, realizing what works, what doesn't work, course correcting. And the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams, very important principle. And at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. This is ownership. They own their process. They own the way they work. You can't really dictate ways of working of an Agile team. You can facilitate, you can give them training, you can have a Scrum Master educate them and teach them better ways of working, but the team is ultimately responsible for the way they work. So here's the Agile onion. What we just talked about in the Agile Manifesto, here are the values and the principles, which you see here in white and blue. These require structural, so organizational structures, and cultural change, right? Of course, the mindset behind it is we're trying to be more customer-centric, we're trying to react to change. We're trying to move towards a learning organization, a performance-oriented organization, more than a knowledge-oriented organization. And here's where I'm starting to come into the detail. The practices, the tools and processes can work in traditional project management and command and control. We see this with continuous integration and continuous delivery being done in traditional project management. So they're more visible, these practices. So some people start with this and they stop there. They're not as powerful. The values and the principles, the optimizing for flow, the autonomy, the cross-functional team, the continual and early delivery, and the course correction that the values and principles bring are harder but more powerful. So structural and cultural change definitely is something you should do if you want to be fully agile. It's not just adopting Scrum. So there's a shift in control. The iron triangle of requirements, cost, and schedule, as we see here that we fully well know, is dictated usually by the contracts and the traditional project management, where here are all the requirements you're going to deliver to us by this date and for this cost. So guess what? Quality usually suffers. Or the scope we can't really change because it's non-negotiable, but we are going to incur the cost, and we're going to try and get addendums in. So we've been trying to control the iron triangle for a long time. We haven't been doing it very well. So let's shift the idea of control. Let's evolve with practices let's evolve from practice focused on schedule and cost to cadence and flow. So let's stop talking about cost. Let's talk about the value we've delivered, regardless of the cost to achieve it. Of course, we need to measure it. There's no point in just talking about value if you don't understand how much you need to produce that value. Let's stop talking about scope and talk about fast feedback. Is this actually what we're doing? So scope is about building the right thing, right? Not building it right. So are we building the right thing? Did your perception change? Let's be agile. And let's talk about flow. So how predictable are we? How fast are we moving? How sustainable is it? Let's stop talking about schedule. So this is the big difference. The constraints and the estimates. We've inverted the iron triangle with Agile. So in waterfall, the requirements are the constraint. They're non-negotiable. So cost, schedule, and quality suffer. In Agile, we've inverted the triangle. There's a team of X amount of people that's working for this amount of time and this amount of iterations. So the cost and the schedule are defined, and it's the sunk cost. What's going to change is the amount of features they deliver. So you should be working on the most valuable first. So we've inverted the triangle. It stops being schedule and cost forecasting. It's about scope forecasting. How much scope have we delivered and how much of it was actually valuable to the customer? So this is the great mindset shift. There's also a shift in planning because schedule and capacity is fixed. Let's look at the Agile onion. Daily iteration and releases are things that we do in Scrum. There's not much about portfolio, product, and strategy, and I can't go into details there, but scaled frameworks try to also help plan for these levels, for strategic levels, like quarterly increments and things like that. But most of the Agile practices focus on executing day by day, having an iteration that spits out a certain outcome, a product increment, and that gets bundled into a release that's then delivered to the customer. So there's a shift in planning. We're saying every X iterations we release. Hopefully we release at the end of each iteration if it's up to standard. So we're talking about forecasting versus scheduling. Here's an example of forecasting. This is taken directly from Azure DevOps. So as we see here on the top, it's forecasting based on a velocity of 20. Now 20 can be man days, can be story points, doesn't really matter. What it gives you is an item of predictability. So with the remaining backlog of user stories, bugs, tasks, whatever you have, this is at the current speed you're going. So you're delivering roughly 20 per iteration. This is how many iterations you're going to have till you deliver all the features that you have in your backlog. So it's much more about forecasting. So we forecast 6 iterations, and as you can see, 8 plus 5 is 13. So if we added the 8, it wouldn't really fit in, but in the next one, it's 24. So this isn't really a hard and fast rule of what fits and doesn't fit. It's the idea that some things spill over to other iterations, but on average, you're going to have 20 story points per iteration. So here we're going to have 13, but because we didn't fully execute on the previous one, this one we're going to have 24. So there's a degree of variability, but it's very much predictable. This is the velocity we're going at. These are how many iterations it's going to take to deliver this amount of features. Now, this can be a minimal viable product, or it can be something else. So it's all about forecasting and being upfront and making this visible to everybody. So again, we're shifting from traditional IT focus from skill-centric silos. We're optimizing for cost regardless of values. We're following a plan regardless of opportunities. We're optimizing for full capacity utilization. We're not looking at queues or handoffs, and we're batching for efficiency. So we're moving away from these paradigms. This is the traditional IT focus. We're definitely moving away from that. The problem here is you're going to find change resistance, because these are the controls people are used to. You can't really say, I'm going to take away all your tools for control and not give them something else. So you need to give them these forecasts that I've shown. So yeah, again, defer to the reading, the second Toyota paradox, how delaying decisions can make cars faster. This is an MIT publication, by the way. I didn't publish the link, but it's in the MIT Press at mit.edu. Okay, so fundamental differences of Agile, just to wrap up before we go into practices. DevOps, here I have a slide about DevOps culture because it's very tightly aligned and in relation to Agile and Lean. So this is a slide again from the DevOps Institute that shows the fundamental differences between traditional IT and Agile/DevOps practices. So in terms of planning and structure, batch size, organization, scheduling, we're going from large to micro. We're going from skill-centric silos to autonomous dedicated sales. We're going from centralized scheduling to decentralized and continuous cadence. We're delivering things regardless of what the schedule says. So there's a cadence that's imposed on us. And about release, information, and culture. So releases go from a high-risk event to like breathing, because we're doing them frequently. Information goes from disseminated to actionable, and culture goes from do not fail to high trust, fail entirely. And of course, metrics and definitions of done change. We go from cost and capacity to flow, value over time. We go from I did my job, my function, to did the feature get adopted? Did the customer actually receive the value? Did he value it as we expected? So let's talk about the frameworks, because we do talk about Agile methodologies. So Agile frameworks group into roughly 3 types. The team level ones, and we'll be talking in detail about Scrum, Kanban, which is a better flow than Scrum, the scaled approaches where you have your Scrum of Scrums, your LESS, which is large scale Scrum, your SAFe, so Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprise, your Disciplined Agile, which is now part of PMI from Scott W. Ambler, your Dynamic Systems Development Method, which is your old one that was also about scaling. And they can also be engineering practice focused. So these are your extreme programming, your feature-driven developments. So in summary, we will be looking at Scrum, which is a specific methodology, but Agile is all about iterating, launching, regardless of the framework. They all do this. Scrum does this in a particular fashion, we'll be seeing, where it goes through sprints and it has daily Scrums. So they're all in contrast to the waterfall methodology, which we've seen. So regardless of the framework you adopt, they all have this idea of it iterating, release, and cadence. So the Scrum framework, by definition, it's a framework within which people can address complex adaptive systems. We've seen about complexity in the beginning, while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. So here's the Agile Scrum framework. Simply put, there's 3 roles here. You have a product owner who defines what needs to be done and sticks it in the product backlog. You have a team that define what they are going to commit out of this product backlog. And you also have the sprint backlog being iterated and the Scrum Master looking at how the work of the team is progressing, how the burn down chart is working. A burn down chart is a control chart to understand if we're on schedule or if there's a lot of variability. So there's a lot of information produced there. And we do an iteration. We do a daily Scrum meeting every 24 hours where we basically talk about three things: what we've been doing, what we're going to do, and any impediments to our work, waiting or any dependencies that are unresolved. At the end of the sprint, we're going to have a meeting and do a sprint review where we look at the work we developed. And here we have the product owner. So what did we learn about the work we developed? Did we meet our sprint goal? Did we actually move closer to what we expected? We do this over the finished work. So it's not a PowerPoint slide. It's actual working product. And at the end, the team does, with the Scrum Master, sprint retrospective. So this isn't about the work performed. It's about how we work. Did we work in the most efficient way? What went well? So we have frameworks such as start, stop, keep. Start doing this, stop doing this, it didn't work, and let's keep this practice that helped us work better. So they own their own working process. So there are 5 ceremonies. There's the release planning, there's the sprint planning, there's the daily Scrum, the sprint review, the sprint retrospective. There are 3 artifacts: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the product increment, and there's the sprint burndown, which is a control chart, which can also be considered an artifact in some circles. There are 3 roles, nothing else. And they're all part of the team. There's a product owner that owns the what is going to be worked on. So he creates the backlog. There's the Scrum Master that facilitates and removes the impediments to flow. So anything that the team feels is in their way of delivering. And then there's the team that are cross-functional. They do not depend on skills outside of the team. They own the how they do the job and how they get things done. So they have all the required skills to deliver. Again, this is the Scrum framework in a nutshell. So regarding the 5 ceremonies, the cadence is definitely, there's a release planning meeting that's optional. There's a sprint, and none of the other ceremonies are optionals in Scrum, by the way. So the sprint planning is done every time at the beginning of each sprint, regardless of the size of the sprint, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and it takes usually half day to a full day, again, dependent on the size of the sprint and the commitment we're going to do. The sprint planning meeting is there for the product owner to tell what he values the most, what the client values the most, and the team can commit to. So the team will say, okay, we can size things, and we'll see this in planning poker, and this is what we can commit to, and we, according to our velocity, we feel that this is the size of the things we're going to do, so this will fit. From then on, we go into the daily Scrum. So every day for 15 minutes, the team gets together to talk about what have we been working on, what I'm going to work on next, what are my impediments. So this is done at an individual level across the whole team. The product owner doesn't interfere, and the Scrum Master is only allowed to talk if explicitly requested. So the team synchronizes the work between themselves. There's full autonomy there. At the end of each sprint, like I said, there's a review and a retrospective. And again, the timeframes depend on how long the sprint is. Sprint review, you show the work, you see what you've learned, you revise your learns, you show the stakeholders. It's a demo, basically. And the sprint retrospective, you look at how we worked, how we could have worked better. So I had a video for Scrum in 10 minutes. I'm so far over the time that I'm just going to plow over it, sorry, because I want to show other other Agile methodologies. So Kanban. Kanban is also something that we see widely adopted, especially for service teams, service industry. And the difference over Scrum is that there's no time boxing. So basically, there's no sprints in Kanban. It's 100% based on flow and queues. So the idea that you go from one backlog to another backlog. This is a way to do an analogy from Scrum. So the difference is that it also limits work in progress. So as soon as there's space in the backlog of a different step or a different team, you can feed into it. So it's very much a pull system to flow from the request to the customer fulfillment. And yeah, here's an example, right? So there's no limit to the amount of backlog work, but there's limit to the amount of work we're working on. So there's a limit of 2. We cannot be working on more than 2. There's a limit of 2 items for waiting, and there is no limit on the things we've done. So it's very much a visual approach where it's really easy to see how flow is going and if it's working or not. This is a basic example of Kanban. This is a bit more convoluted one where you have more stages, right? And you have work in progress limits for priority. Well, actually, you don't have limits here because it's 0, but you should. But this is, you also have the swim lanes. So you have an idea that there are things that are higher priority even in Kanban. So critical incidents, sysadmin, network infrastructure, DBA. So this is a lot of what you see in frontline support and service industry. So yeah, okay, right. Scaled Agile frameworks. So the frameworks we just saw work at the team level, right? And the team doesn't depend on anybody. So one of the major criticisms of Scrum and most of the other team level Agile methodologies is that it brought on the business, but it left out the operational side of it, and it only solved for the team level. So the problems arise when there was a coordination necessary across program and portfolio levels. Again, let's remember the complexity domains at scale. As we can see, there's a problem when there's multiple solutions to deliver a unified product to a client. So this is where Scaled Agile framework showed up. Of all the Scaled Agile frameworks, and I'm going to go briefly through them, the most widely adopted scaled frameworks are definitely Scrum of Scrums and Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprise. Scrum of Scrums is the most adopted by companies of all sizes and across industries. Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprise is the most adopted for enterprises. These figures are in the DevOps Skill Up reports. It's roughly 30% of enterprise uses Scaled Agile Framework. Some of them don't use any Scaled Agile Framework, but it's by far the leader in enterprise. So let's go briefly through them. Scrum of Scrums conceptually is really simple. Is you have your own teams here doing Scrums, and then a person from that team, a representative, joins a different team, a higher level team, and does a Scrum of a product portfolio level, and then gets back to their team delivering their product portfolio level. So it's really simple. It's multiple Scrum teams working within a Scrum with their representatives. So these talk about how things coordinate, how they deliver an increment from all their teams together. So this is Scrum of Scrums in a nutshell. And this is available on the Atlassian site. Here's the link. Large-scale Scrum is a bit different. As you can see, it's a very nice graphic, but basically it just means that you do the sprint planning, and they differ from Scrum of Scrums because you have an idea of an area backlog. Instead of a single product backlog and several Scrum teams with their own product backlog, you then have area backlogs that teams iterate over. And the key difference, they say, is that this isn't a Scrum of Scrums. This isn't multiple Scrum teams. This is a single Scrum team in their conception. So it's an interesting read at the very least for that. And here's SAFE. So let's just highlight really quickly, there's loads of things here. Let's just highlight the essentials. So on the essential level, if you can see the highlight here, you have your Scrum, your Kanban, which we just talked about, and your extreme programming as engineering practices. So I've just talked about these Agile methodologies. These are the essential, so the things you should start, the building block, the foundation layers for Scaled Agile. Then it builds on the idea that the team backlogs are there, and you have the Agile teams with the product owner, the Scrum Master, the team. This is standard, very easy to understand. It works for the team level. You can deliver with this structure alone. This is where it becomes a bit more convoluted. The idea is a solution, so beyond the team level. This means you have not only a team backlog, but you have a solution backlog and a solution intent and compliance and governance requirements. And now you have a different team altogether. You have a solution manager, you have a solution architect, and you have a solution train engineer. So this is the person that's going to step up delivery and prepare everything to go, and all of the team backlogs to converge on a single solution. There's a lot more to it because this is the main practice. And then there's the portfolio level. And this is where we get lean budgets. So I'm almost drawing to a close. Let me just give you safe in 3 minutes, a short video. And I know I am very much over time. Got a bit distracted there. Let me just check if you can hear sound. And thank you for bearing with me. Share sound. I don't think there's sound coming through. Yeah, this.
We have sound.
You do? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
So the question is there another way to do this? SAFe suggested, you know, and when you see this, you're like, Thomas, this is even more complex than what you just said, right? But what you see here is a picture where there's a lot of stuff behind it. And, you know, it's not that bad actually when you have been at the workshops where you learn to understand this a little bit. So let me give you a 2-minute introduction to the ideas here. First of all, there's a team level, and it's just the same stuff. It's Scrum, Kanban, whatever team stuff you're doing, no news there. Then you have the program level, and this is just a container. So you could draw it like this also. This is an idea where you have your teams, your Scrum teams, Kanban teams, and you have these 3 guys at the bottom. They are sort of servant leaders for this group of teams of teams, also called an Agile release train or ART. And what they do is you have product management, the PM, who looks at what we should do. Then you have an architect and a release train engineer. The release train engineer is basically a Scrum master. So sort of the same roles as a Scrum team, just at a bigger fractal scale there. Now the architect is a bit weird actually, especially if you read the Agile Manifesto. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about those roles in a bit. But first, the other important thing is that this is not a functional silo. So this is not a department of engineers or business people. You want to have this train be cross-functional. So everybody in there who is needed to create a product is part of that train. So the same cross-functional idea as a Scrum team. So if you have multiple products in your organizations, you would have multiple of these trains. And then this top layer, the idea there is pretty simple too. It just says, instead of funding projects, fund these trains, fund your products. And that's really cool because then you can start the year by saying, okay, we built an iPhone last year, you know, updated that was pretty cool. Let's build another version next year, but we don't need to know exactly what features you're building. We can postpone the decisions about scope for later. And then we actually get the opportunity to explore and do some of the cool things that you also talked about, Martin. So that's pretty easy to understand, right? That's the basic idea of SAFe. Those 2 things, have a group of teams and fund them instead of projects. But then, how do we make decisions within this group? Is something different there?
Okay, so that was SAFe in 3 minutes. Hopefully it gives you an idea and it shows that some of the things that I was talking about are addressed in Agile practices. Maybe not in the most efficient way, but definitely interesting. So let's close it off with Agile practices and the structures that enable this. So most of you will come across user stories, which is a way of creating the voice of the customer. This is, instead of framing requirements, you do user stories. So user stories are basically different from tasks. So user story describes a piece of functionality from the point of user. It's divided into features and business processes. It's basically a conversation driver. And it's framed in the following way: as a specific person, so as a developer, or actually, sorry, as a banking app customer, I want to be able to change my transaction limit within 5 minutes, so I can make transactions safely when I need big transactions. So this is the idea of what I need, who I am, and the clear benefit of it. So it's definitely about defining the user stories. There are criteria and practices that you can use. A user story should be independent, so you can release it alone. It should be negotiable. So maybe there are better ways of developing the user story and something that you should be able to talk to your product owner about. It should be valuable to the customer, and we should understand the value, because that's going to drive our decision making. It should be estimable, so we know it can fit in a sprint. It should be small, so we can actually iterate and increment over it and get the feedback. And it should be testable, because otherwise, how do we know we've finished? How do we know we've done? So user stories are a best practice in the Agile world. Follow the INVEST criteria. There's some people that prefer the 3 C's. 3 C's is the idea that you have a card that defines the user story, you have a conversation based on it, and you have confirmation criteria. So how you know you're done. Card, conversation, confirmation. Really interesting topic there too. Definition of done and definition of ready to start. These are in the Scrum Guide. They're really important practices too. This is the idea that you have criteria for when you say user story is done. It can be things like every user story has at least one test associated and has one test that's failed and passed after the initial failure. Every user story has been peer reviewed. These are the definitions of done. If you have not done this, you can't say the work is done. So it's been tested, it's been reviewed. These are very important to actually achieve flow. The definition of ready to start is on the other side. So you can't really commit to developing a user story if it isn't within the INVEST criteria, if it isn't small, if it isn't testable. So most teams will just say, I can't start a story if it doesn't adhere to the INVEST criteria. Another Agile practice, planning poker. So how do we size things? So planning poker is really easy. You give people a set of cards. It can be numbers, it can be t-shirt sizes, XL, L. You can use your hands. There's several ways you can go about it. But the idea is you go through rounds until you converge on a value or until there's sort of agreement from the team. So only the team is allowed to play planning poker. You present a user story as a product owner, and they will give you their estimates. In this case, when someone has a question mark, they hijack the conversation and they say, I still have some things that I don't understand. I can't produce an estimate. If you don't have the question mark, there's interesting things that happen. You should have the highest estimate and the lowest estimate present their case, because someone thinks it's more difficult. Someone thinks it's easier. Maybe there's some problems here that need to be verbalized. So you usually have these two people have a conversation. Why do I think it's longer? Why do I think it's shorter? And then you vote again. You do this 3 times or until you converge. You can't go ad eternum, but this is a way of estimating size and achieving commitment. Planning poker. The sprint review and the sprint demo we've talked about in the Scrum practice, they're essential because this is the way you show the work. As we see, we show what's been done. This is where you collect the feedback. And the sprint retrospective is where you talk about the way you're working and if it's suiting you. Think about blameless postmortems and retrospectives. So it's more important what failed and what we could have done better than who to blame. Other XP practices is swarming, mobbing, programming. So yeah, in short, there's a lot more Agile practices that you can do. You see this in several of the frameworks, Moscow grouping, story mapping. So instead of having a flat backlog, which you don't really understand, you can do things like have bundles of parts of the backlog that you say, these are essential, these are must-have features that the client can't live without. For your product developers, the must-have is basically things you need to have to compete with other products, for instance. So it's things you customers already expect of you. Should have are the delight factors. So these are the things, if you want to go to release a product, you should have this to actually be differentiated, to be better than your competition. These are the wow factors. These are the things we're going to do different. The could have is, well, if there's enough time, please do this. And the won't have is also essential, which is saying, we will not do this. We have decided this is no value. So we should be very good at also removing things from the backlog. A backlog isn't a wish list. A backlog should be short. A backlog should be timely. Yeah. Here's a way to also distribute the effort in those groups we just said at the Moscow. Consider 60% of your efforts should be in must-haves. You can have around 20% of should-haves, and then you have contingencies. We could have this. We'll also live without it. So insert slack at the backlog level. Those are the best practices. Think about your prioritization criteria and try to make it uniform as much as possible so things don't clash. There's a traditional problem of having multiple bosses. Don't have multiple backlogs. Have a single one. Have people converge on the priority before it goes into the backlog. Think about the higher customer value, the higher benefit to business, the high risk, the dependencies between items, if it's easy to be implemented. But be aware that easy to be implemented will usually give you low value things, but will leave the team happy because it's easy to do. That's not really very customer centric. So be aware of your backlog prioritization criteria. There are loads of examples of Agile outside IT. Like I said, the advent of Agile, specifically Scrum, is from a non-IT world. Look at Agile HR practices. There are some link here. Look at Shamrock Foods as an example of Agile being adopted outside of IT. And as we've seen, there's loads of challenges. Agile has the organizational structure side to it, the culture side to it that it will fight against. But it also needs client agility. Some clients do not want to be Agile. They are not available for feedback every week. They're not available for feedback at the end of every sprint. They are not available for co-creation. They do not want an Agile contract. They want a traditional iron triangle. So the idea that you have waste it or lose it budgets is also another challenge. So you end up having feature factories, which is very similar to the projects that you already know are going to fail, but because they're funded, we're going to see them towards the end. So don't go for waste it or lose it budgets. Release budgets and teams and pool budgets and pool resources. Make them more effective. Assign different work to them. Do not have them working just because they're idle, because you're just doing non-value added work. And don't optimize for shiny only. So most of the Agile teams are only done in new product development. Realize that this is bad. Realize that only funding teams and only having teams do funded projects will leave out technical debt. It will leave out infrastructure work that needs to be done. It will grind you to a halt. Think about the return and in what time frame you're going to get for the products, because it's not equal for all of them. So this is what we've been doing before Agile. It's been a difficult, muddy road, taken with a lot of effort. We introduced Scrum and Agile techniques, but we still, which is the paved road in my analogy, but we still have a tractor. We haven't looked at the organizational structure. We haven't changed the engine and the practices. We've just changed the management framework. So we need to think a bit beyond that in budgeting, in financing, in client agility, in contracts. So in summary, we need to have more effective engineering techniques, organizational structures and practices. We need to change the engine. We need to fight the current budgeting scheme. At some point, budgeting is largely determined by revenue model. These are the typical contracts we still find. We do a firm fixed price, which is anything but Agile. We do times and materials that is very much Agile, but there is no scope negotiation. So we're just giving resources. We do target price and cost plus, and something here in between is an Agile contract where there's shared risk and shared economic opportunity. And there's also something to be said about delivering value. So we need Agile contracts somewhere around target price or cost plus. And this, again, is in the scaled Agile framework too. So we need to change the current financing paradigm. There's project finance and loads of things, VAL, internal rate of return, hurdle rate, weighted average cost of capital. I know all of these practices, but this doesn't really work. And there's corporate finance, where you just look at the top line and bottom line, and you don't make it per sector. You look at some cost centers, some market strategies. There's something to be done in between project finance and corporate finance. Where are the product and the service finance? How are we measuring return? How are we measuring the cost of delay? Are we doing it implicitly, explicitly, or are we just saying this project is strategic, right? So in summary, in today's terms, there's still a lack of agility because you're either a cost center or a strategic initiative. So there's a great book by John Smart. He's been doing this since 2016. He did an agile transformation at Barclays, and he talked about quarterly budgets, agile continuous funding in a sooner, safer, happier book. And they started in 2016 at Barclays to pilot agile investment with quarterly rolling waves instead of annual budgeting. So that was 6 years ago. Well, 7 years something ago. Well, 7 years almost. So it's definitely something to look into. Organizational structures for new ways of working. This is how I close out. Sorry for the overrun of 30. So you see loads of people adopting the microservices or the agile organizations. Here you see a tweet by Matthew Skelton, which is a very good author that I will reference. And you hear people say, we're agile and the team, but we're still organizationally a monolith. There's hope to this. Like I said, Toyota works very much like a functional, traditional function organizational structure, but it works. There's literature to this, making functional orientation work. You can see this in the Lean Enterprise book, which is the images on the right, but it also gets referenced in the DevOps handbook, which is a book in the left. So there are new paradigms emerging, like platform as a service instead of just shared services or complicated subsystem teams. The idea here is that, and here's the Spotify model, where you have chapters, tribe leads, product owners, and guilds. So this is a way of achieving matrix organization. But the gist of it is you need to stop thinking of teams as one size fits all. It's not just featured teams. And the organizational structure that supports this can be like Spotify does in tribes. So here you see a product owner and you see a team, and the team has chapters. So this is your functional chapter. You need a specific person from this chapter, which can be development or testing. So every team needs at least a tester, at least a developer. Then you have some emerging practices, and that's where you have guilds. So it's not mandatory to have these skills, but they're emerging skills within the company, and they organize as guilds. You have the tribe leads to synchronize between the tribes. So there's several ways to go about it, like I said. You can look at Kotzer's work on the dual operating system, which I said we were going to have a look at the video, but this is 4 minutes and I've already overrun. Just looking at the background, basically, it's the idea that you can have a traditional organizational structure, but there's a network structure that works a lot faster and can be spun up and turned down a lot faster than current paradigms. So in summary, the organizational structure, you need to leverage autonomy. You need to think a bit like AWS has been doing since 2002, if I'm not mistaken. You build it, you run it. You have a team API for how you interact with others. So your interaction patterns are defined, and you need to realize that not all teams are created equal. Platforms, shared services, these are different teams. They are not feature teams. They are not agile teams per se. They are delivering specific types of experience and interaction partners. There are 3 collaboration models for teams defined in Team Topologies, a book by Matthew Skelton. So you have X as a service, so testing as a service, DevOps as a service, facilitating teams, so your Scrum Masters facilitating the flow of work, and collaboration teams, teams that, like cloud teams, they know about cloud. You can't train everybody in the team for cloud development. They come and collaborate and develop a cloud approach for you. So here are the 4 team types and the 3 interaction modes as defined by Team Topologies. There's the link. So some teams are stream-aligned teams, very much aligned to a revenue model. Some teams are enabling teams, like the cloud teams. They're there just to enable you to use cloud. They're experts. They come and they do collaboration, which is this model here. And sometimes they just facilitate. So they don't actually do the work for you, but they teach you to do. And you have some teams like the complicated subs teams and the platform teams or any shared service team where you do X as a service. So I'm giving accounting, I'm giving HR. HR is usually as a service. They don't collaborate as much. So yeah, and this is how they would fit in an organizational structure and how it would work. So you have a complicated subsystem team. It's working as a service and a platform team as a service to a stream-aligned team. And here you have an enabling team, such as, for instance, a cloud or a DevOps expert team, helping this stream-aligned team. The stream-aligned team is aligned to a business model, to a product, to a revenue model. So yeah, in summary, that was Agile Methodologies. I'm sorry for the half an hour overrun. I was looking at the chat sometimes. I've seen some messages of encouragement and some saying, I'm sorry, I can't stay longer. That's my fault, not yours. But thank you for staying with me. And I hope I've covered the whole gamut of things, and at the very least spiked your interest to looking at Agile at team level, but also beyond the team level.
Thank you, Antonio. I think it was our fault. It was ambitious to cover all these topics in just 90 minutes. I don't know if anyone has questions. I know that many people already left, but there are still some people here. If you have any questions, I think Antonio will be happy to answer it.
Yeah, I am. I'm so sorry for the lack of interactivity, and I hope I didn't bore you to death. Thank you for staying on. I hope it's just not the case that you've left the laptop on.
We are receiving good feedback. Thank you, guys. Okay, so no questions. We will share the slides, and also we are recording the session, so you can watch it again afterwards. I don't know if Roberto wants to say some words or.
Just to finish this webinar, congratulate Antonio for his outstanding webinar. And also we want to invite you to participate in the next webinar that we are going to organize for the next 4th of June about open innovation. In this case, another partner of the IT Virtual Project, Laval Majek Paul, is going to organize it, and we will start with the communication in short. Okay.
Right. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon then.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.